Thank you. I'm Tim. Sorry in advance, my laptop didn't work, so I'll be jumping around a little bit. I don't have the links pre-prepared, and I won't be able to do a live demo, but I took screenshots of it in advance. This tends to happen. Thank you for coming to my talk. My talk is, I'd say, quasi-Lord of the Rings themed. I tried to throw in some references. It just seemed relevant to the topic of discussion, which is copier. So this is a link to the presentation. It'll send you to like a PDF printable version of it. Cool. So today we're just going to motivate copier a little bit, give a little bit of background from my kind of personal development life, and kind of motivate why we're talking about it today. We'll talk about copier, I'll say a little bit. I'll talk about some of the options that I use. It's a very full-featured piece of software. I'm not a author of it. I'm not even a contributor to it. I'm just an enthusiastic user. So I'll show you some of the things that I do. But we're not going to go into a super high level of detail because there's just too much for us to talk about in this amount of time. I'll show you my example setup, which is fully public, so you guys can go and take all that code and use it to build your own versions. And then I'll just mention some real-world use cases, again, both from my open source development life, but also some corporate relevant use cases as well. So, and I think I'll lean a little heavy on the Lord of the Rings references to start, but I'll try and leave it at the beginning. So this is sort of what I see a lot of when I write some libraries, but I also see it out in the open source world. You might write something like mycoollib, and then you're like, oh, it would be really cool if we had a pandas namespace for that. So maybe I can just do pandas.mycoollib. Some built-in integration. And then everyone in the open source world decides, oh, we all like polars now. So great, you got to go and write, mycoollib.polars, where you write some polars extensions for your library. So you end up having not just your coollib and your coollib pandas, but maybe you also have mycoollib polars. This is me a lot too, where it's oh, I've got this cool idea. So as we all do, the very first thing when you have a cool idea is you go and buy the domain name for that cool idea before you've written a single line of code. So, if you're like me, I've got 7, create React app kind of scaffolded projects where I changed the name of the project and maybe the background and nothing else. And they're sitting around and maybe I'll come back to them. I still pay for the domain name for some reason, but I like to think that I'll come back to them someday. This is also me. Learned Rust attempt number 23. I've got these libraries sometimes. I'm sure this happens to some of us where it's very popular for some reason. It's got 4,000 stars or 400 stars or 40 stars, some number of stars. You haven't really paid attention to it in a long time. It's not deprecated, but it's still there. I do this a lot too, where I just write a useless CLI. It's not useless. It wouldn't exist if it were useless, but it just maybe does one thing. Again, still not something I want to abandon, but maybe it's not something that I want to consume an overly large portion of my time. Customizing editor themes, again, it's just another thing that you want to carry around with you. Not ready to deprecate it, but it still needs to update over time. And I threw in the Zig thing just for fun. So again, if you're like me, you're not just going to make these private folders on your computer. You'll maybe make a GitHub repo for it. Maybe it'll be public, maybe it'll be private, but you have this thing now that you cared about at one point, and you want to make sure that it can kind of live on for a little bit longer. So this is what I used to do. Every, I'll say 3 or 4 months, I just go around and all this accumulated things that the ecosystem has changed. So in this case, I was moving to Rough from Flake 8. I was moving to Hatch from just kind of a setup tools-oriented workflow. I added a binder link because I wanted people to be able to easily play around with this library. I would just go in and manually apply all of these changes to the 20, 30, 100 repos that I cared about at that point in time. And there's a force push at the bottom, but there's a lot of conflicts, and this was a very manual process to go through and do these things. All these different changes that had to be applied. A lot of these are kind of silly things, this is a git ignore file being updated because GitHub updated their template git ignore, and I just copy pasted it around from one of my other repos. So I always had a golden source, this is the repo I've most recently developed on, and I have to kind of copy it around manually through all these other places. Here's just again another example of It's kind of annoying but useless diffs, right? Where here I use makefiles a lot for managing projects, and it's like, at the end of the day, I'm just changing from linting via flake8. I know this is probably very small. Linting via flake8 to linting via rough. But I still have to go through all of these different projects and do it. So for me, and I think this applies to a lot of people, repos tend to kind of fall into a couple of different categories. So we'll start with the easiest one, which is projects that should be deprecated. And that is not what this talk is about. Sometimes you just have to hit that, archive this repository button and let it go. It's done. You're not going to work on it anymore. So like I said, that's not what this talk is about. For a lot of things, it's just little projects, little utilities, little scripts, little CLIs, apps. Maybe they serve a single purpose. Maybe they do a couple of things, but you're not really actively working on them, but you don't want to deprecate them. And these are the ones that I think kind of hit the hardest because they don't get the updates. You don't migrate them to the new lint rules you've decided you want. And they take a lot of time when you want to go back to them, which I think kind of disincentivizes you from going back to them. So I call these like the hobby projects. These ones are less common. I like to think that we try to convince ourselves that they don't exist at all. But these are your sort of feature complete projects where they're obviously not deprecated. They're still actively used, but there's not really much more to do on them. You've accomplished all the things you wanted to do in this project. But at the same time, you want them to still pick up bug fixes. You certainly don't want someone on the internet to think that they're deprecated and now make a fork and, a fork that's slightly different, has a slightly different feature set, and I have to open an issue and be like, oh, why did you fork this? I would have just taken the contributions back. So I call this, done projects. So this is another one that I get a lot because I work in open source at companies. So a lot of times you'll be writing open source libraries for a company, and then you'll leave that company, and your job functionality will change slightly. So they're important projects. You certainly don't want them to be abandoned because they're kind of a hallmark of a prior employment, but they just might not be important at this point in time. And I've found a lot over my career that it might not be important at one employer, but then you go to another employer and it kind of comes back and it becomes important again. So on my GitHub, there's a bunch of prior employer projects that tend to, they have a way of floating to the top of the most recently updated list. So these are like your back burner projects. And then there's obviously the projects that you really care about right now, right? It might just be an application, like a library that you're distributing. It could just be some research project that you're working on that you want to have a little bit of linting and testing around. For organizations, so an open source organization or a tech company, anything that's kind of producing libraries like this, there's a couple of extra ones. So you see a lot of examples or bootstrap or getting started projects. This is probably in public the #1 use for a library like Copier or some of the competitor libraries to it. These are super important, I think, if you're operating a SaaS company. You want to have examples of using your SaaS product. And then the last thing, which you'll also see a lot with big tech companies, is if I'm Supabase or something like that, there's the Supabase Python client, there's the Supabase JavaScript client, there's the Supabase Go client, and stuff like that. So you might have variants of your library that you want a bunch of things to be the same, code of conduct, contributing guidelines, stuff like that, but maybe there's some specific differences between them. So we have these different kind of categories of projects, and some of them are going to be very important for you to keep up to date all the time, and some of them are not going to be important for you to keep up to date all the time. But they all kind of, in an ideal world, we'd be able to kind of support all of them, from the smallest project, smallest and most insignificant project, to the largest and most important project. So we also have a bunch of requirements. It can't be that difficult to maintain all of these things. So we want to start with a template where we say, here's all the configuration and the lint rules and the README and stuff like that. But then we also want to be able to kind of customize certain aspects. So there needs to be an interactive component where I can answer some questions about things, and it'll populate my template accordingly. So obviously, this is my standard Python rough linting configuration. This goes in every single one of my projects all the time. And then I might tweak it later on, but this is basically always going to be there to start. So lint static analysis configuration, especially if you're at an organization, you might want to have standard lint rules across your company. A lot of test coverage stuff. Again, this one shows up in every single one of my Python projects. Setting some baseline coverage metrics and ignoring some standard, not coverable paths, stuff like that. For CI/CD, this is another big one. So again, if you're at an organization, probably your GitHub actions are all going to be kind of the same. Your issue templates, your PR templates, code owners, things like that, you're going to always want to start from like a template. So we need to be able to specify that these things are all the same. I use makefiles a lot for orchestration. So again, basically all of my libraries look like this. There's a how do I install this thing? How do I run the linter? How do I run the auto fixers? Stuff like that. Documentation, here's just a bunch of other examples, like stuff that is just always going to be the same that you want to put in your template and copy paste everywhere you run things. I'm kind of going from a very developer-centric approach, but if you're a data scientist or a researcher or something like that, there's going to be the same types of things that you want to make sure are always present. Then there's some things that you want to customize. So when we clone this template, we want to be able to answer some questions and fill in some details. So the name of the project is a pretty good one to be able to customize. You might have variants in like license information. I said some of that variant from before, so the language, the framework, the topic, stuff like that, you want to be able to customize. So I don't want to call anybody out. As a Jupyter contributor, I feel like it's OK. So in the Jupyter Lab organization, we used to provide all of these cookie cutter templates. So Jupyter has a lot of ability to have extensions. So you can have like renderer extensions, so you can specify a custom way of rendering Parquet files or something like that. People were writing their own custom extensions. So we provided these templates. There's an extension cookie cutter TypeScript, extension cookie cutter JavaScript. So there you see those like variants where a lot of the stuff is going to be the same between them, but one's going to have TypeScript and a kind of compilation step, and the other one might not. Here's one for just making a custom theme, et cetera. So it's a very common thing in organizations to want to be able to produce all these variants. But now you've got 6 libraries that you have to maintain independently. So we want to prompt users for some inputs, selectively include some files based on those inputs, change some file contents based on those inputs. And this is a really critical one that is kind of the point of this talk, is in an ideal world, as the template changes, we also want to be able to pull those changes in. Otherwise, it's just like a snapshot, and we still have to, after we've done that snapshot, we have to go back through all of these libraries and apply the updates over time. So, talked about background and motivation. Let's talk about some options. So, GitHub templates is kind of the first option that I think comes to mind. They built it into GitHub, not from the beginning, but eventually. And you'll see, template repository listed on the top. I don't even really want to talk too much about this one. I kind of wished it had gone in the direction of Copier, but it hasn't, and it's a proprietary product, so I feel comfortable bashing it a little bit. But it's quite limited. There's not much you can do with it. It doesn't even prompt you to change the name by default. So in the JavaScript world, they've done a lot more work in this area. So create React app was like one of the canonical kind of getting started things. It's deprecated now, but you'll see a lot of these like npm create, new Vite or parcel or svelte or whatever you want, like application. And it might prompt you with some questions. There are other bootstrapping tools in Python and other ecosystems. But a lot of these end up being very bespoke. So it's a very hand-tuned collection of questions. But also, those questions are written as part of React or Vite or something like that. They're not something that you, for your own library, would just be able to copy and paste and change things. So the real kind of main player in the ecosystem was cookiecutter for kind of a long time. It's still a great library. It does all of these things that we want as far as prompting users for inputs, being able to selectively include files, stuff like that. It is widely adopted across the Python ecosystem. So you will see a lot of like, here's the cookie cutter for our library or something like that. But the key missing feature was always that it's a snapshot, one and done. So as the cookie cutter changes, you don't get to pull in those changes easily. There are some libraries that try and bridge that gap, but in my experience, they don't work as well as you would want them to work. So that brings us to copier, which is, as the name of the talk suggests, the subject of the talk. So it's copier-org/copier is the kind of GitHub repo, and they have extensive documentation. I'm not going to go through all of it, but those are the links. So all of the functionality of cookiecutter. There's a lot of this selective inclusion, choosing different options via Jinja. And the key thing is that you can sync back with the base template when the base template changes. So that's that key functionality. So let's actually look at like a real instance of this thing. My example setup is, hopefully it wasn't too bold to take the GitHub org Python project templates. But that's what I did. So it's github.com/python-project-templates. And this is where I store my public copier templates. In the corporate world, obviously, it's going to be private, and even kind of other language variants I haven't published yet. But for my Python project templates, this is where I keep them. And in particular, I set up a copier template, which is Python project template/base, where my copier template repository lives. So I'm not going to be able to run through it live, but I have screenshots of it, so it should be OK. But this is sort of where my personal, whenever I go to start a Python project, or if you go on my GitHub, the vast majority of my Python projects extend this template. The key element here is the copier.yaml. And it's a very simple kind of format where you provide the questions that you want to ask the user. So I can say something like, what is the name of your project? I can give it types. Obviously, again, the copier documentation details all of the available options. And I can ask, give a prompt to the user for what they need to answer. That link brings you to my copier template, which has those exact lines that I pulled for this presentation, as well as a few other things, which I'll talk about in just a second. When you run this, you pip install copier or uv pip install copier, or however you like to get your Python libraries, grab copier. And you can run this copier copy command with a link to that Python project template/base.git, and then a path to your new project. And I would have done this on my laptop, but I anticipated that it probably wouldn't work. So I gave a little bit of the output here. It'll prompt you with these help text that you provided in your copier.yaml. So you can say, what is the name of your project? My lib. What is your project description? My cool description. Any other questions you want to ask, you can ask. And those variables will be available to you in the Jinja templating within your copier repository. So when I prompt you for project name and project description and some other things, in the PyProject toml, in my base template, I can just say, pyproject.toml.jinja, which is the indication to copier that I want to use some of those template variables here. And I can just reference project name in kind of normal vanilla Jinja syntax. All right, so if we go over here, you'll see that for Python, for example, that is just taken from here. With a little bit of things that, again, I'll talk about in a second. So I'm not going to talk about all of the functionality because there's a ton of it. There's all kinds of different types. You can provide options. I'll just talk about a couple of the things that I use as a hopeful kind of indication that it might be extensive enough to suit your needs. I do a lot of if the name of the library is my space lib, well, I probably want the Python library to be called my-lib. And I probably want the import name of the module to be my_lib. So you can do things like, if you prompt the user for project name, don't prompt them for project name formatted, but run some included Jinja function to transform that name in some way. So this is the syntax for that. And that name slug would just do project name, again, Jinja syntax, vertical bar, to lower, something like that. So it's not a lot of copier-specific functionality. It's a lot of stuff that if you've ever used Jinja would be familiar. Options are a huge one. So I got kind of annoyed writing a Python library and then adding some JavaScript to it later on, or adding a Rust extension. So I just kind of made this base template in large part to have these options available to me. So I can say, do you want to add an extension? And again, in that copier copy command, it'll prompt you for the extension that you might want to add. It'll ask you, none, which is going to be the default, which is just pure Python, C++, Rust. And then I can say that my template actually comes from that subdirectory. So within the copier YAML, you can reference those Jinja variables. And again, you'll notice that we have these values that corresponds to which of these subfolders it will use. So when you select nothing or the default, which is Python, this will be the template folder that it uses. And again, you see a lot of that Jinja syntax popping up. If you selected C++ instead, it'll use this as that base folder. And again, a lot of shared functionality, but you see the templating pop up. All this optional inclusion of files. So maybe I'm in a corporate world where some users might be using GitHub Enterprise or something like that, but other users might not. You can have a folder with a slightly weird name that itself kind of references those Jinja variables. So if I want to only include this folder if the user answered yes to the use GitHub Actions question, I can write it something like this. Right? So the actual folder name would be, open brace %, so on and so forth. Same deal, like maybe I only want to include this file if the user said, hey, I'm using the JavaScript extension. So you can have your file name be this slightly weird looking, but clearly just Jinja syntax file name. So I do this a lot for like if you want to add something on versus not. Asking for more information is also an easy thing to do. So this is something that cookiecutter also supports, but I found it a lot easier to use in copier. So if the user selects, hey, I want to use JavaScript, you can ask follow-up questions. So you can say, OK, when the user said they want to add JavaScript, ask them if they want to use npm or yarn or pnpm, or I'm sure while I've been giving this talk, a new one has been created. There's also like the ability to do a lot more like complicated functionality. So you can write your own Jinja macros, and you can pull them in to do different things. So I can say, OK, the user has provided some variable. I'm going to do something more with that. And I want to store that in this template variable. And what I'm going to do is from myfunc.jinja import the extract info macro and run the extract info macro on the previously collected variable. Right? And again, looks a little bit strange, but if you've seen Jinja before, it's just kind of vanilla Jinja syntax. So, and I think the most important part is you can dump all of the answers to all of the questions that you ask the user into a file. I don't know why I call this Jinja. It should be CFG or something like that. But you can, oh no, it has to be Jinja to grab all the variables, right? So you can kind of dump out the answers to the copier questions that you had in a file. And this is what's going to enable you to update later on. So I think the TLDR for all of this is basically you can do all of the different customizations you want to do, selective inclusion of files, prompting for additional options. And I keep instantiations of all of the template variants that I have as other repositories. So I already showed the base template here. But because I can choose a C++ template or a JavaScript template or a Python template or whatever, I keep these ones around as separate repos. So here you can see that I actually ran the copier process, and I said I want to do a pure Python project. I don't want to get emails about it. Here's the GitHub org. Here's the project description. Here's the project name. Here's the Python primary version that I specified, the team. This is that copier answers file that I just mentioned. And this template has been instantiated with all of those various parameters. So over here, when I said that I want the module name to be module, I want the PyProject toml to have the formatted name, to have the team and the email, the instantiation of that template will have the name, the team, the email that I answered in that copier prompting. So I keep these around for all of the different variants. Right? C++, Rust, Jupyter. This serves two purposes. I always do this. One, so I can always just look at, because the Jinja can be a little bit difficult to parse when you're just looking through it. Whereas when you give it generic enough of names, it's pretty easy to see, OK, that's what was filled in. But also, things like Dependabot will run on these repos. So I can get some information about, oh, I need to update the template itself by seeing that the instantiations of the templates have been updated. And then, of course, in addition to these instantiations, I use the templates for all of my different projects. OK, so the key functionality here, all of the stuff that we talked about so far you could do with cookiecutter. The key functionality for copier is that you have this update ability. There are docs on it. They have a nice little graph of how it actually works. In practice, it feels a lot like a Git update or a Git merge or a Git pull. It goes through this process of seeing where your instantiation of the template might differentiate from how the template itself has changed. And it will prompt you with conflicts in the same way that Git might prompt you with conflicts, merge conflicts or rebase conflicts. All you do is you run copier update. There are some command line arguments for just keep all the defaults or just squash all the conflicts. But I like to do it interactively. And it will give you, here's an example from just one of my libraries where it is a instantiation of this template. You can see from the copier answers. But it gave me some update of my template repository with some conflicts. So because it uses the kind of standard syntax, it's pretty easy to see, OK, something has gone wrong, and I need to choose. In this case, I was updating a bunch of the JavaScript dependencies. And I think Dependabot had independently updated them on the base repo. So you have to go through and kind of merge them. But it's nice that it gives you the ability to update. But also, this is something that we're doing all the time anyway. In any kind of collaborative project, you're going to be going through the process of dealing with merge conflicts and stuff. So that was great functionality. It also kind of gives you the ability to do it automatically. So this is something I use for my personal repos, but it ends up being a lot more important in organizational repos, which is you have this ability to kind of push an update to other users. So in another organization, which I boldly took a name, I wrote like a copier update GitHub action. So this will just go in and run the copier update, conflicts and all, whatever happens, and it'll open a PR with it. So this is a way of kind of lightly pushing to myself in some cases, but in an organizational context, end users, that there are some changes that you might want to pull in. I don't version my templates, which I probably should, but if you git tag them, you can run them with proper versions as well. So here's an example in just one of the template instantiations of that action going and pushing those template updates. You can also obviously change your choices. One thing to note is that you shouldn't just update the answers file. But here's an example of a repo. It's not merged yet, but where it was OK. It's written in pure Python, and now I want to add Rust. This is always something where it's like, OK, let me go back through. Let me find the most recent Rust project I've been working on and see what things need to change. No, I just ran copier update, and instead of choosing Python, I chose Rust. And it went through, and it made a bunch of changes. Here you can see me changing that answer. I also chose 3.9, so I could do multiple versions of Python in the same library. But it went through, and it made all of the corresponding changes. It knew that this project had started from a template. It knew that there's a Rust template. And it went through, and it merged the differences that needed to be made. So this just, again, reduces that friction where it's like, let me throw in a C++ extension or a Rust extension. So real-world use cases. For individuals, people like me, I got a lot of projects, a lot of things going on. It just reduces that friction. It makes it a lot easier for me to jump project to project, keep things on the back burner for longer, because I know that it's not going to be as difficult to bring them back to full boil. A couple of examples again. This was a PR I made to just switch to using UV. And then the automation pushed it into a bunch of my repositories, where now, hey, you're going to use UV. It's going to push it out. If I wanted to not merge it, that would have also been fine. I think for organizations, there's talk of mono repo versus not mono repo, but having a template system like this kind of gives you a lot of the benefits of a mono repo without a lot of the downsides. If you're changing strategic or tools, so for example, I went from using Mamba for some of my Conda projects to Rattler build. It's very easy. You apply that change in the template. It gets pushed out via automation or pulled in via users into all of your template repos. Same deal, pip to UV was another one. There was a CMake problem in the CI build wheel project. I pin it in the template. I can immediately push it out to all of my libraries. PyTest AAO HTTP, Bodo also had projects, also had problems that required pins. Pandas, like 2 days ago, had an issue with their release where they still say they support 3.9. So you can kind of centrally manage all of your repositories. Instead of having to go through all of them and change them, you do it all from one template repo. At an organization, if you have like CI/CD that needs to change, it can be difficult to get users to pull things in. Doing it via templates like this kind of reduces that friction. So an example that we had to deal with was adding vulnerability scanning to the standard pipelines. And again, kind of raising the bar for an organizational user, for all of your end users, is easily manageable with this. A bunch of other things here, examples from real life I don't want to talk about now. I will say that for skeleton code, for in-class assignments as a professor, it's also very helpful because they can kind of pull that template and kind of all be starting from the same base point. So in general, copier was a massive improvement for my quality of life. I hope everyone will check it out and use it. Update via push or pull, which is huge. Templates for central management of personal organizational projects. And I think the kind of overall summary is that for individuals, you can reduce the overhead of managing projects, back burner projects, side projects, inactive projects. And for organizations, you really get that mono repo style consistency and standardization. You keep your documentation up to date. You keep your examples, your client libraries all up to date. and you help your end users who might be instantiating your templates keep themselves up to date via this kind of update process. So that's everything. The link to my personal templates are at github.com/pythonprojecttemplates. And you can find me on GitHub. It's just my name. Cool. Thank you so much.